You really want to do that? The woman asked softly, her voice steady in the cold night air as Officer Daniel Hayes paused for half a second, just long enough to register the calm in her tone before brushing it off with a scoff, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting across the glossy surface of her black sedan parked on the shoulder of a quiet two-lane road somewhere just outside Fairfax County, where the hum of distant traffic faded into a tense silence, and the only sound left was the rhythmic ticking of the engine cooling down. Daniel adjusted his stance, confidence radiating from the badge on his chest as he leaned slightly closer, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior of the vehicle like he was already certain of what he would find, like the outcome had been decided the moment he saw her behind the wheel, and Ava Carter stepped out slowly when instructed. Her heels touching the asphalt with deliberate control, her posture upright, composed, almost out of place. In a moment that was supposed to feel chaotic, her eyes briefly flicking toward the small blinking light on his body camera before returning to him, unreadable. Imagine standing there, miles from anywhere familiar, being watched, judged, reduced to assumptions before a single word of explanation even matters, yet she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to defend herself. Because something about her stillness carried weight, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Daniel circled the car, his movements sharp, methodical, narrating his actions under his breath as protocol demanded, though there was an edge to it, a quiet satisfaction building as he opened the rear door and began to search, each movement a little more intrusive than necessary, each glance back at Ava carrying that same unspoken message that she didn't belong here, not on this road, not in this car, not in his version of order. The air felt heavier with every passing second, the distant glow of streetlights barely reaching them as shadows stretched long across the pavement, and still, Ava didn't move, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her breathing even, her gaze unwavering as if she were watching something unfold that he couldn't yet see, and then Daniel's flashlight stopped, the beam locking onto something tucked beneath the passenger seat, a small, unfamiliar device that immediately shifted his expression from suspicion to certainty, his lips curling into a tight, satisfied smile as he reached for it, lifting it carefully like it was proof of everything he already believed, his voice rising slightly as he turned toward her. Ready to speak, ready to claim control of the moment, but before the words could fully form, a faint vibration cut through the silence, low at first, almost unnoticeable, then growing, approaching fast, and Ava's eyes didn't follow the sound, didn't turn toward the road, because she already knew exactly what was coming. The low rumble grew louder, not like passing traffic but something deliberate, controlled, and Daniel Hayes felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle shift in the air that made his grip tighten slightly around the object in his hand as he glanced toward the road where two black sport utility vehicles appeared from the darkness, their headlights cutting clean lines across the pavement without the urgency of sirens. Without the chaos he was used to, just precision, just intent, and for a brief moment he hesitated, the confidence that had carried him seconds ago flickering as the vehicles slowed to a stop behind his patrol car. Ava Carter did not turn, did not react, her posture unchanged, her gaze still resting on him as if this moment had already been written long before he ever stepped out of his cruiser, and Daniel cleared his throat, trying to regain control. His voice firmer now as he lifted the device slightly, ready to assert authority, to explain what he had found, but the doors of the vehicles opened before he could speak, and the individuals who stepped out moved with a calm that did not match the tension of the scene, dressed in dark suits, their presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind that did not need to raise voices to be heard. One of them approached with steady steps, his eyes briefly scanning Daniel, then the car, then Ava, and something unspoken passed between them, something that made Daniel feel like he had stepped into a conversation he was never meant to understand. Imagine standing there, still believing you are in control, while every signal around you begins to suggest otherwise, while the ground beneath your certainty starts to shift in ways you cannot explain. Daniel straightened, instinctively adjusting his posture as the man stopped a few feet away, his tone measured, not aggressive, not rushed, just certain, asking a simple question that carried far more weight than it should have. "Officer, what exactly are you doing with that vehicle?" And Daniel responded quickly, almost defensively, explaining the stop, the search, the object he had discovered, each word sounding less convincing the longer he spoke, because the man did not interrupt, did not react, just listened, his expression unreadable. The night seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of the world fading even further as the tension narrowed into that single exchange, and then the man's eyes shifted toward Ava, not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with recognition, and that was the moment something inside Daniel tightened, something quiet but undeniable, because recognition was not supposed to be part of this, not here, not like this. Ava finally moved, just a slight turn of her head, her voice calm, almost gentle as she spoke a single sentence that did not sound like a defense, did not sound like an explanation, but more like a confirmation of something already known, and the man gave a small nod, the kind that ends a conversation without needing more words. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the device in his hand, then back to them, the certainty he had clung to now feeling heavier, harder to hold on to, as if it no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of him. And for the first time that night, he realized that whatever he thought he had discovered might not be what it seemed at all. Daniel Hayes felt the silence stretch longer than it should have, the kind of silence that did not come from uncertainty but from people who already knew the answer. And the man in the suit took one slow step closer, his eyes never leaving the device in Daniel's hand as he spoke again, his tone unchanged but now carrying a quiet finality. "I am going to ask you one more time to lower that." And something about the phrasing made Daniel hesitate, because it was not a request in the way he was used to hearing, it was not loud, not forceful, but it left no room for refusal. Daniel glanced at Ava Carter, expecting to see relief or fear or even frustration, something human that would fit the situation he believed he was in, but she gave him none of that, only that same steady gaze, as if she had already moved past this moment, and was simply waiting for him to catch up, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Imagine realizing that the person you thought you understood has been several steps ahead the entire time, that every move you made was already accounted for before you even made it. His fingers loosened slightly around the device, not fully lowering it but no longer holding it with the same confidence. And the man in the suit reached into his jacket, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to retrieve a slim leather case which he opened with practiced ease, revealing an identification that Daniel could not fully read from where he stood, but he did not need to, because the reaction it triggered was immediate, not from Ava, not from the other agents, but from the atmosphere itself, as if the entire scene had just shifted into a different category, one he was not trained to handle. "You have interrupted an active federal operation," the man said calmly, each word landing with precision, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, a realization forming that he did not want to accept, because it meant everything leading up to this moment had been wrong, not partially, not technically, but completely. His mind raced back through the stop, the assumptions, the search, the way he had spoken, the way he had looked at her, and for the first time that night, doubt was no longer a passing thought. It was a weight pressing down on him, heavy and undeniable. Ava finally took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make her presence impossible to ignore, her voice calm but carrying an authority that did not need to be announced. "That device is not evidence," she said, her eyes briefly flicking to the object in his hand before returning to his face. "It is part of something you were never supposed to see." And Daniel swallowed, the words settling in as he slowly lowered his hand, the confidence he once held now replaced by a growing awareness that he had crossed a line he did not even know existed. The man in the suit gave a slight nod to one of the others behind him, and without urgency, without raised voices, the situation began to shift around Daniel, not chaotic, not aggressive, but controlled in a way that made it clear he was no longer the one in charge, and as the weight of that realization fully set in, one question echoed louder than anything else in his mind, not what happens next, but how much damage had already been done. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, and Daniel Hayes could feel them settling into something heavier than confusion, something closer to consequence, as the man in the suit extended his hand with quiet expectation, not demanding, not rushed, just certain, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing the device into his palm, the motion slow, almost reluctant. Like he was handing over more than just an object, like he was surrendering control of the moment itself. The agent examined it briefly, his expression unchanged, then passed it to another operative who secured it with careful precision. No sudden movements, no unnecessary words, just a level of coordination that made it clear this had been practiced long before tonight. Ava Carter remained where she stood, the faint glow of the patrol car lights reflecting across her face, her composure unshaken. Her silence louder now than anything Daniel could say, and for the first time he noticed the details he had ignored before, the way she carried herself, the way she observed rather than reacted, the subtle awareness in her posture that suggested she had never truly been out of control, not even for a second. Imagine realizing that the person you tried to question had been evaluating you the entire time, that every word you spoke had already been measured, recorded, and understood in a context you never considered. Daniel shifted his weight, his mind searching for something to hold on to, protocol, authority, anything familiar, but the structure he relied on felt distant now, like it no longer applied to the situation unfolding in front of him, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the certainty it once had, asking what this operation was, what was happening here. The question sounding smaller than he intended, because deep down he already knew he was not going to get the kind of answer he expected. The agent looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a calm that carried its own kind of weight, and when he responded, his words were measured, deliberate, leaving no space for misunderstanding. "This was contained until you made it visible." And Daniel felt that sentence land harder than anything else, because it was not just a statement, it was a line drawn between what should have happened and what now could not be. Undone, Ava took another step forward, her presence no longer passive but defined, her voice steady as she spoke again, not to challenge him, not to accuse him, but to state a reality he could no longer ignore. "Every decision you made tonight changed the outcome of something bigger than you realized." And Daniel's gaze dropped briefly, the weight of that truth settling in, heavier with each passing second, as the distant world beyond the road seemed to fade even further, leaving only the quiet, controlled movement of the agents around him, the flashing lights that no longer felt like his, and the growing understanding that whatever came next would not be determined by him. The man in the suit gave a subtle signal, and the team began to reposition, not urgently, not chaotically, but with the kind of precision that did not leave room for error. And as Daniel stood there, no longer directing, no longer certain, one realization became impossible to ignore, that the moment he thought defined authority had never truly belonged to him at all. The road felt different now, quieter in a way that pressed against Daniel Hayes's thoughts, as if the night itself had shifted to acknowledge a reality he had not been prepared to face, and he stood there beside his patrol car, no longer moving with purpose but with hesitation, watching as the agents continued their work with a calm precision that did not match the tension inside him. The flashing lights that once felt like control now seemed distant, almost irrelevant, their reflections stretching across the pavement without meaning. And Daniel's eyes moved from one figure to another, searching for something familiar, something that would restore the balance he thought he understood, but nothing did. Imagine realizing that the rules you trusted were only part of a much larger system, one that operates beyond your view until you step too far into it. Ava Carter walked past him slowly, not rushed, not avoiding him, but not acknowledging him in the way he expected either, her presence steady, her focus already shifting beyond the moment that had consumed him, and that absence of reaction, that lack of confrontation, left a sharper impact than any argument could have, because it meant she did not need to prove anything, not to him, not here. Daniel swallowed, his mind replaying every detail again, the initial stop, the assumptions, the tone in his voice, the certainty he carried into a situation he never fully understood, and now each of those moments felt different, heavier, like pieces of a sequence that led directly to this outcome. One of the agents approached him briefly, not aggressively, not even confrontationally, but with a quiet professionalism that carried its own weight, asking for his identification, his report, the footage from his body camera, and Daniel complied, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he was becoming aware of how each action might be interpreted beyond his control. The device was already gone, secured somewhere he could no longer access. And the vehicle he had searched was no longer just a car, it was part of something he could not define, something structured and intentional in ways he had disrupted without realizing it. Ava stopped near the front of one of the black vehicles, speaking briefly with the man in the suit, her tone low, controlled, and though Daniel could not hear the words, he could see the dynamic clearly now, not as equals in conflict, but as professionals in alignment, and that clarity settled into him with a quiet finality. The night air felt colder against his skin, the distance between what he thought this moment would be and what it had become stretching wider with every second, and as he stood there, no longer directing, no longer certain, one thought pressed forward, steady and unavoidable, that this was no longer about a traffic stop, not about suspicion or procedure, but about a line he had crossed without understanding, and now everything that followed would be defined by that single moment where he believed he knew exactly what he was doing. Time no longer felt like it was moving forward for Daniel Hayes, it felt like it was tightening around him, every second pulling him deeper into a realization he could not step away from, and the quiet efficiency of the agents only made that feeling stronger, because there was no chaos, no raised voices, no visible urgency, just controlled movement and silent coordination. The kind that did not need to announce authority because it already owned it. Daniel stood near his patrol car, the familiar shape of it now offering no comfort, his radio silent at his shoulder, his hands empty, and for the first time since he had stepped onto this road, he did not know what his next move was supposed to be. Imagine being trained to act, to respond, to take control, and then suddenly finding yourself in a moment where none of those instincts apply, where action itself becomes uncertainty. One of the agents walked past him carrying a secured case, another speaking quietly into a device. Daniel could not identify, their voices low, deliberate, each word chosen with care, and it became clear that whatever this operation was, it extended far beyond this stretch of road, far beyond anything he had been part of before. Ava Carter remained near the vehicles, her attention focused, her posture relaxed but precise, and when she turned slightly, her eyes met Daniel's again, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something more measured, something that acknowledged the situation without needing to confront it directly, and that look stayed with him longer than any words could have. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to explain, to justify, but nothing came out, because every explanation he could think of belonged to a version of this moment that no longer existed, and he knew it. The man in the suit approached him once more, not quickly, not slowly, just with the same steady presence that had defined everything since his arrival, and he spoke in a tone that left no space for misunderstanding. "Your report will be collected and reviewed, along with your footage." And Daniel nodded, the motion small, automatic, because there was nothing else he could do, nothing left to assert or defend. The night air carried a faint chill now, the kind that settles in when everything becomes still, and the flashing lights behind him continued their cycle, red to blue, blue to red, but they no longer defined the scene, they no longer framed the moment, because the center of control had shifted entirely. Ava took a final step toward the open door of one of the vehicles, pausing just long enough to speak, her voice calm, quiet, but unmistakably clear. "Next time, look closer before you decide what you are seeing." And then she stepped inside without waiting for a response, without needing one, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Daniel remained where he was, the road stretching out in front of him, unchanged and yet completely different, and as the vehicles began to move, disappearing into the darkness they had come from, one thought settled in with quiet certainty, not about what he had found, not about what he had stopped, but about what he had revealed, and how some moments do not expose others, they expose you. The darkness closed in again as the last set of headlights disappeared down the road, leaving behind only the fading echo of an operation that had never truly belonged to Daniel Hayes, and for a long moment he did not move, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because for the first time in years, action no longer felt like control, it felt like exposure. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued to pulse against the empty asphalt, but now they seemed smaller, almost insignificant compared to what had just unfolded, and Daniel reached up slowly, almost instinctively, touching the small camera clip to his uniform as if it might somehow ground him, as if it could confirm that what had just happened was real and not something his mind had constructed in the tension of the moment. Imagine realizing that everything you believed you were documenting has, in fact, been documenting you, every word, every assumption, every decision preserved in a way you cannot revise or explain away. He exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, and turned toward his vehicle, the familiar shape now carrying a different weight, not authority, not certainty, but consequence, and as he opened the driver's side door, the interior light flickered on, revealing the tools of his routine, the radio, the notebook, the procedures he had followed countless times before, all of it unchanged and yet completely different in the context of what had just taken place. Daniel sat down slowly, his hands resting on the steering wheel without gripping it, his eyes unfocused for a moment as his thoughts replayed the scene again, not in fragments this time, but in sequence, each detail sharper, clearer, more difficult to ignore, the tone in his voice, the way he approached her, the certainty he carried without question. And how quickly that certainty had unraveled. The road ahead stretched out into darkness, quiet and still, offering no answers, no direction, only distance. And for the first time that night, Daniel did not start the engine immediately, he just sat there, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling metal, the faint hum of electricity in the dashboard, the kind of silence that forces reflection whether you want it or not. Somewhere in that silence, a realization began to take shape. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, undeniable, that this moment would not end when the vehicles disappeared. It would follow him, into reports, into reviews, into conversations he could not predict, and more than that, it would stay with him in ways no procedure could prepare him for. He glanced once more at the empty stretch of road where everything had changed, and then back at his reflection faintly visible in the windshield, the uniform still the same, the badge still in place, but the understanding behind it no longer untouched. And as his hand finally moved toward the ignition, one thought settled quietly, firmly, that tonight was never about what he found in that car. It was about what had been revealed in him, and some truths, once seen, do not fade. When the lights go out. The engine finally turned over with a low steady hum, but Daniel Hayes did not pull away right away, his hands resting on the wheel as the dashboard lights cast a faint glow across his face, and the road ahead remained empty, stretching into the darkness like a question he was not ready to answer. The routine that once guided him now felt distant, like something he had memorized but no longer fully understood, and as he sat there, the events replayed again, not with confusion this time, but with clarity, each detail sharper, more defined, harder to ignore. Imagine replaying a moment over and over, not to remember what happened, but to understand why it happened the way it did, why certain choices felt automatic, why certain assumptions came so easily, and why they led exactly where they did. His radio crackled softly, a dispatcher checking in, the familiar voice breaking through the silence with routine questions, asking for status, for updates, for confirmation that everything was under control, and Daniel hesitated before responding, the pause small but noticeable even to himself, because for the first time, the words he was expected to say did not match what he had experienced. "Traffic stop concluded," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than usual, leaving out everything that could not be explained in a standard report, everything that did not fit into the structure he had always relied on, and the dispatcher acknowledged without question, moving on to the next call, the system continuing forward as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and Daniel knew it. He shifted in his seat, glancing at the empty passenger side, then at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black vehicles again, half expecting the night to return to what it had been before. But it did not. It remained still, indifferent, unchanged in appearance but altered in meaning. The camera on his uniform continued to blink, recording everything, and he reached up again, this time not to adjust it, but simply to acknowledge it. To recognize that the story of this moment was already captured, already existing beyond his control, and that realization settled deeper than anything else. The road sign a few yards ahead caught his attention, its reflective surface briefly illuminated by his headlights, pointing toward directions he had traveled countless times before. Yet now even that seemed different, like every path forward carried a weight it did not have before. He eased his foot onto the brake, then released it, not moving, not yet, because movement implied decision. And decision implied certainty, and certainty was something he no longer held as easily. Somewhere in the quiet, a thought formed, simple but persistent, that this was not the end of the moment, not something that would fade with distance or time, but something that would follow him into every stop, every interaction, every judgment he made from this point forward. And as he finally shifted the vehicle into drive, the tires rolling slowly onto the open road, one truth remained steady in his mind, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, that authority without awareness is not control, it is exposure, and once that line is crossed, there is no returning to the version of yourself that never questioned it. The patrol car moved forward at a steady pace, the tires humming softly against the asphalt as Daniel Hayes drove through the quiet stretch of road, the darkness ahead broken only by the reach of his headlights, and yet his focus was not on where he was going but on everything he had just left behind, the kind of moment that does not stay in the rearview mirror no matter how far you drive. The radio remained silent now. The earlier check-in already passed, and the absence of noise only gave more space for his thoughts to settle, to organize themselves in a way they had not been able to before, and as the miles slowly added up, each passing road sign, each empty intersection felt less like routine and more like markers in a shift he could not ignore. Imagine continuing forward physically while mentally you are still standing in the same place, replaying the same exchange, the same words, the same look in someone's eyes that changed everything you thought you understood. Daniel adjusted his grip on the wheel, not out of tension but out of awareness, the simple act feeling different now, more deliberate, like every movement carried intention instead of assumption, and he found himself noticing details he usually overlooked, the stillness of the roadside, the faint outline of trees against the sky, the way the light reflected off distant signs, all of it sharper, more present, as if his perspective had shifted beyond just the situation itself. His mind returned again to Ava Carter, not as a figure in conflict, not as someone he had stopped, but as someone who had seen the entire situation from a place he could not access, and that realization stayed with him, not as frustration, not even as regret, but as something quieter, something more persistent, the understanding that presence and authority are not always the same thing. The dashboard clock ticked forward, marking time in seconds that felt longer than usual. And Daniel realized that what unsettled him most was not the outcome, not even the fact that he had been wrong, but how easily he had been certain in the first place, how quickly he had acted without questioning the foundation of that certainty. The road curved gently ahead, leading him back toward familiar streets, neighborhoods he had patrolled countless times before, yet even that familiarity felt different now, like returning to a place that looks the same but no longer feels the same. He passed a gas station with its bright lights cutting through the darkness, a few cars parked under the canopy, ordinary life continuing without pause, without awareness of what had just unfolded miles away, and for a moment he wondered how many moments like that existed, unseen, unrecorded, shaping people in ways that no one else would ever notice. His gaze shifted briefly to the rearview mirror, the empty road behind him offering no answers, no resolution, just distance, and he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not forced, just enough to acknowledge the weight he carried forward. Somewhere between 1 mile marker and the next, a quiet decision began to take form, not spoken, not fully defined, but present. The kind of decision that does not announce itself but changes the way you move, the way you see, the way you choose in moments that come after. And as Daniel continued driving into the night, one truth remained steady beneath everything else, that the most significant part of what happened was not what had been taken from his control, but what had been given to his awareness, and awareness, once gained, does not allow you to return unchanged. The familiar streets began to close in around Daniel Hayes as he drove deeper into the city, the glow of streetlights replacing the emptiness of the highway, storefronts passing by in quiet repetition, and yet nothing about it felt routine anymore, not the turns he had made 100 times, not the intersections he could navigate without thinking, because now every movement carried a different kind of awareness. One that did not come from training but from something far less comfortable. Imagine returning to the same world you left hours ago only to realize it is not the world that changed, it is the way you see it, the way you interpret every detail that once went unquestioned. His patrol car slowed as he approached a red light, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence while a few cars idled nearby, drivers unaware, disconnected from the shift that had taken place just miles away. And Daniel found himself watching them differently, not as potential situations, not as patterns to assess, but as people moving through their own moments, unseen, unjudged, until someone decides otherwise. The light turned green, but he did not accelerate immediately, the pause subtle, almost invisible, yet meaningful in a way that would not have existed before, and when he finally moved forward, it was with a control that felt less automatic and more intentional. His thoughts returned again, not to the mistake itself, but to the moment before it, the exact point where assumption replaced observation, where certainty filled in the gaps that should have been questioned, and that moment stood out now with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. The radio crackled again, another call coming through, routine, expected, a minor report just a few blocks ahead. And Daniel listened carefully, not just to the words but to the tone, to the details, processing them slower than he normally would, not because he did not understand, but because now he wanted to understand fully before acting. He acknowledged the call, his voice steady, composed, but there was a difference in it, a slight pause before speaking, a consideration that had not been there before, and as he turned toward the location, the city lights reflecting off his windshield, he realized that the shift inside him was not temporary. It was not something that would fade with distance or time. It was something that would define every decision moving forward. Imagine carrying a moment with you not as a burden but as a lens, something that changes how you see before you decide, how you listen before you act, how you question before you conclude. He pulled up near the address given, the scene quiet, uneventful, just a parked vehicle and a concerned caller waiting nearby, nothing urgent, nothing complex, and Daniel stepped out of his car with a calm that felt different now, not driven by control but by awareness, his posture steady, his gaze focused, but not fixed, open instead of narrowed. As he approached, he noticed details he might have overlooked before, the way the caller stood, the way they spoke, the context of the situation beyond the surface, and he listened fully, not interrupting, not assuming, allowing the moment to reveal itself rather than forcing it into a conclusion. And in that small, quiet interaction, far removed from the intensity of what had happened earlier, a realization settled in, steady and clear, that change does not always come in dramatic moments. Sometimes it shows itself in the smallest decisions that follow, in the way you choose to see before you choose to act. And as Daniel responded to the call with a calm precision, one truth remained constant beneath everything else, that the line between authority and understanding is not drawn by a badge, it is drawn by the choices you make when you believe you already know the answer. The interaction ended without urgency, the concerned caller reassured, the parked vehicle confirmed to be harmless, and Daniel Hayes returned to his patrol car with a quiet sense of completion that felt different from before, not driven by resolution alone but by the way he had reached it, step by step, without rushing to define the situation before understanding it fully. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and as he settled into the driver's seat once again, the city no longer felt like a series of problems waiting to be solved but a network of moments waiting to be understood, each one carrying more than what appeared on the surface. Imagine approaching every situation not as something to control but as something to observe first, allowing space for clarity before action, and realizing how much that space can change the outcome. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping it, not preparing for the next move with urgency, but simply present, aware of the quiet hum of the engine, the distant sounds of traffic, the subtle rhythm of a night that continued whether he noticed it or not. His mind returned once more to the road where everything had shifted, but this time the memory did not feel overwhelming, it felt instructive, like a moment that had already begun to reshape the way he processed everything that followed. The body camera on his uniform continued its steady blink, capturing each second without pause, and Daniel glanced at it briefly, no longer seeing it as just a tool of documentation, but as a reminder, a silent witness to the choices he made and the awareness behind them. The radio crackled again, another routine update, another call waiting somewhere across the city, and Daniel listened carefully, his focus steady, not rushing ahead of the information, not filling in gaps with assumptions, but letting the details form their own picture before he responded. He acknowledged the call, his voice even, composed, carrying a quiet confidence that no longer relied on certainty alone but on understanding, and as he pulled away from the curb, merging back into the flow of the city, his movements felt smoother, more deliberate, guided not by urgency but by intention. The streetlights passed overhead in steady intervals, casting brief patterns of light and shadow across the windshield, and Daniel found himself noticing them, noticing everything, the way people moved on the sidewalks, the way cars slowed at intersections, the subtle signals that once blended into the background now standing out with clarity. Imagine seeing the same world with new attention, where nothing has changed except your willingness to look closer, to question what you think you already know, to pause before deciding what something means. As he approached the next location, another quiet scene waiting to unfold, Daniel slowed the car, taking in the details before stepping out, not searching for confirmation of what he expected, but allowing the situation to reveal itself on its own terms, and in that moment, a deeper realization settled in, steady and unshaken, that the most powerful shift is not in what you do, but in how you choose to see before you act, because that choice defines everything that comes after. And as Daniel stepped out into the night once more, one truth remained clear. Beneath every decision he would make from this point forward, that awareness is not something you turn on when needed, it is something you carry, something that shapes every moment whether anyone else sees it or not. The night continued to unfold in quiet layers as Daniel Hayes moved through another call, another moment that on the surface seemed simple, almost forgettable, yet beneath it carried the same opportunity that now defined everything he did, the opportunity to pause, to observe, to understand before acting. And as he stood beside a resident explaining a minor concern about unfamiliar activity in the neighborhood, he listened fully, not just to the words but to the tone, the context, the details that once might have been dismissed as unimportant. Imagine standing in a moment where the outcome depends not on how quickly you respond but on how deeply you are willing to listen, how much you are willing to see beyond the surface of what is being said. Daniel nodded slowly, asking a few measured questions, not leading, not assuming, but allowing the conversation to reveal itself naturally. And the tension that had been present when he arrived began to ease, not because he asserted control, but because he created space for clarity, and in that space, the situation resolved without escalation, without misunderstanding, just a simple acknowledgement that not everything requires forceful certainty to reach a conclusion. He thanked the resident, his tone calm, respectful, and as he turned back toward his patrol car, the city around him felt steady, not in the sense that nothing had changed, but in the sense that he was now moving within it differently, more aware of the layers beneath each interaction, more conscious of the responsibility that came with every decision he made. The door of the patrol car opened with the same familiar motion, yet as he sat down, the meaning behind that action carried more weight, because now it represented not just routine but intention, a deliberate choice to approach each moment with a level of awareness that had not been there before. The radio remained quiet for a brief stretch, giving him time to sit with the silence, to let the rhythm of the night settle around him, and in that quiet, his thoughts returned once more to the earlier encounter, not with the intensity it held before, but with a clarity that allowed him to see it fully, to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. Imagine recognizing that a single moment can shift the direction of every moment that follows, not because it forces you to change, but because it shows you the cost of not changing. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze steady as he looked out at the street ahead, the glow of streetlights stretching into the distance, and he realized that the most significant part of what had happened was not the presence of authority he had encountered, not the operation he had unknowingly stepped into, but the mirror it had held up to his own actions, his own assumptions, his own certainty. The camera on his uniform blinked steadily, capturing the stillness as much as it had captured the tension earlier, and Daniel understood now that every second recorded was not just evidence of events, but evidence of choices. Choices that define not only what he did, but who he was in those moments, as he started the engine once more and eased back into motion, the city unfolding ahead of him in quiet familiarity. One realization remained constant beneath everything else, that awareness is not something that arrives once and disappears, it is something that must be carried, protected, and chosen again and again, in every decision, in every interaction, in every moment where the easy answer is to assume instead of to understand. The city had quieted into that late hour where movement slows and everything feels suspended between what has happened and what is still to come, and Daniel Hayes drove without urgency, the streets no longer a series of tasks but a landscape of choices, each one shaped by something deeper than routine, something that had settled into him long after the flashing lights and dark highway had disappeared behind him. Imagine carrying a moment not as a memory you revisit but as a presence that walks beside you, influencing the way you see, the way you listen, the way you decide even when no one else notices the difference. The patrol car moved steadily beneath the glow of streetlights, reflections sliding across the windshield in quiet rhythm, and Daniel's eyes remained forward, not searching, not anticipating, just aware, fully present in a way that did not rely on control but on understanding. The radio remained silent for now, a rare pause in a job that rarely allowed stillness. And in that silence, there was no pressure to act, only space to think, to recognize that the night had not simply been a sequence of events, but a turning point that had reshaped the way he carried his badge, not as a symbol of authority alone, but as a responsibility to see clearly before acting. His thoughts returned one final time to Ava Carter, not as someone who had challenged him, not as someone who had overpowered him, but as someone who had revealed something, not through confrontation, but through presence, through certainty that did not need to prove itself, and that realization lingered with a quiet clarity that did not demand attention but refused to fade. Imagine understanding that the most powerful lessons are not taught through force, but through moments where the truth becomes impossible to ignore, where the reflection you see is your own. Daniel slowed at an empty intersection, the red light holding him in place for just a few seconds longer than necessary. And as he waited, he caught his reflection faintly in the glass, the uniform still the same, the badge still resting where it always had, yet something behind it different now, something more aware, more deliberate, more careful. The light turned green, and he moved forward without hesitation, but also without assumption, the road ahead no longer something to dominate but something to navigate with intention, and that shift, subtle yet profound, carried more weight than any single moment that had caused it. The camera on his chest continued to blink, recording quietly, and Daniel no longer saw it as something watching others, but something reminding him that every choice, every tone, every glance mattered in ways that extended beyond the immediate moment. The city stretched out around him, unchanged in its structure, unchanged in its rhythm, but entirely different in how he now moved through it, and as the night carried on, one truth settled into place with quiet certainty, not as a conclusion, but as something that would echo forward into every moment that followed, that he had worn the badge believing it gave him the right to decide, but now he understood that it demanded something far greater. The discipline to question, the patience to understand, and the awareness to see beyond what is easy to assume, because in the end, it was never about the authority he held, it was about the clarity he chose, and that clarity would define everything that came after.